back. We continue with the High Five, the special mini series spotlighting the insights of the five biggest minds driving the biggest bottom line results in mobile today. And I want to welcome Cameron Thom. He is the Chief Business Development Officer at Adikteev, a company redefining performance, retargeting, and user retention. So obviously, a great match. But not only that, because Cam has been a driving force behind Adikteev's own growth for over 6 years. And frankly, I can't think of a better or bigger mind to invite to discuss how you can grow through retention. So Cam, here you are. Are you pumped? Are you excited? Is this for you?
I can't be not pumped. Thank you for having me.
Well, we talked about how the show is focused on how marketers can grow, but I've also been watching Adikteev, significant growth there as well. And also you've shifted focus towards sales in Asia, a new office in Korea, by the way. So congrats on that as well.
Thank you so much. I mean, it's been an exciting year with a ton of international travel. We're exploring new markets, like you mentioned, and partnerships. So we're in growth mode, and post privacy, it feels like somehow we've really come back to the momentum we had prior to those initial dark days. So it feels really good.
When I read that, I was thinking of something because I used to also do some consulting for a company in India, and we would have these long discussions about the differences between East and West and what we can learn, because, of course, that is not just a mobile first market. That was mobile only. There's never been anything else but. So just curious, all the travel, all the excitement, have you noticed differences between how marketers approach growth through retention in West and East that you can share?
From a tactics standpoint, I don't think there are drastic differences in methodology, but the app landscape is different. And when you're talking about APAC, there's obviously many different countries, but in basic terms, we're focusing more on the Korean market, eventually China, Japan. A lot of companies are there already, obviously, but we are very heavily leveraged in gaming and working with gaming companies. So that was an obvious expansion opportunity for us, but we're not ham-handed enough to think that we can have a one-size-fits-all approach to all of those. And so it made sense for us to initially focus on South Korea after talking to a number of experts in the field. But generally what you see there on the landscape front are the rise of super apps that you really can do all your day-to-day tasks in one portal, which from a user perspective is quite nice. And from an engagement perspective leads to the type of organic behavior that US companies, dream of, having those users log in so often, with TikTok-like numbers. The other thing that contributes is the huge share of the Android market there as opposed to iOS. So you have a really engaged, really measurable audience, and that naturally lends itself to way more of an embrace around retargeting and retention. When we took the trip to Korea, everybody said retargeting was a no-brainer, and they love it, which is not the case in all markets. Usually it's more of an uphill battle to talk about the differences between that and UA, but really they embrace it. And I think some of those factors obviously contributed to it.
They're miles ahead in super apps. And I know every year we say, the super app concept, when is it coming to the West? But it is inevitable because you want to do more with the apps and you sort of want to build these businesses. I guess now it's all about sustainable growth as well. So if you're in the app for one reason, why can't you be doing other things with it? So it makes a lot of sense. And you've been an advocate of sustainable growth since the very start, before it was a big deal. A little bit like a lone wolf in the wilderness, maybe. I don't know. Was it ever frustrating for you, Cam? Because I know that you've been talking about from the very start, and now, hey, to our credit, we're starting to listen.
Yeah, I mean, of course, anytime you believe in something that can help clients and have actual value to them, like I believe retargeting can in most cases, and it's not widely embraced, it can lead to some frustration, sure, but that can also be very motivational factor sometimes when it's hard to get out of bed in the morning, right? It's peculiar that retargeting was so embraced to the desktop world, but less so when you think about the nature of websites versus apps. And it's a very specific action of downloading an app onto something like your personal device with a limited amount of real estate. Less of an issue as smartphones are having more space now, obviously, and for businesses spending so much money on paid installs, but not necessarily recouping their expenses or seeing low retention figures and really starting to wonder where their money went. These things naturally lend itself to cycles where they care more about retention and start to investigate the tools they have at their disposal. And, even though I've been waiting for some clients for years, finally it's the time, and that can be very rewarding in its own right.
So yes, you were a champion of retargeting from the start, to your credit. Another thing you did, and you actually turned me on to this, so credit to you, because I didn't know the difference between rules-based approaches. I mean, I understood the logic of it, but I didn't understand the shortcomings. Where are we now with that? Why do you think we're seeing this shift to more adaptive strategies? Maybe not always the ones that you personally promote at Adikteev, but certainly people are listening.
Yeah, I mean, going back to our original conversation, I think it was a year and a half ago, something like that. When we talk about rule-based approaches in mobile marketing context, you can think about your mobile measurement partner in the event postbacks you have set up. The user installed in the last 90 days, hasn't used the app in the last 7, and is thus defined as a lapsed user who we would need to retarget. The problem is that the user has completed all of these things in the past, and as a marketer, you haven't been able to capitalize on any predicted outcomes because you're waiting for the cohort to fully bake, as they say. So obviously, with the rise of machine learning and AI, you can develop predictive models that allow for marketers to start to understand the likely outcome before it happens and then take action. In a very real case, that would be retargeting them at day 3 rather than day 7, because it's much more likely you still be able to reach them at a low cost rather than wait until it'll take a lot of advertising dollars to get them back into the app. So this becomes quite handy as user behaviors change to the product and the onboarding flow or other feature releases in the app. And ultimately, what most people and businesses want is a personalized and smooth experience to keep the user engaged without annoying them. And with rule-based approaches, sometimes it's too little, too late.
Just dead simple. People don't always follow rules. So why should marketers? Why shouldn't there be something more adaptive? You looked at individual marketers, not just individual customers, individual marketers as well, because you have recently at Adikteev conducted a survey with over 120 marketers looking at trends and retention. So one finding that stood out for me was the emphasis on holistic retention strategy, integrating multiple teams, multiple touch points, maybe a little bit of that Asian flair as well, because they get it. They know that all the touch points matter and they have to do it holistically, particularly in a super app. But tell us a little bit about why holistic retention.
Yeah, I think what we were hearing and tried to validate this with the survey, with the economic climate, you have less budget in general to spend on UA, and the privacy changes made it even more expensive and challenging. So you have business leaders downsizing marketing departments who have traditionally been very siloed between classic retention, so lifecycle tools like push and email, and performance marketers who handle UA and retargeting. These are different tools in the MarTech stack, even though the MMP will measure all of it and manage different points in the user journey almost separately. So suddenly when the business leader says, we don't care about which team gets the credit for keeping that user, just that we are going to refuse to lose that user, it becomes more of a symphony and leveraging every tool you can to keep them consistent with the user and their journey and build that loyal relationship. Whereas in the past, it's been pretty fractured and the users tend to fall between those silos. So we've seen, business leaders just refusing to accept that these teams don't talk to one another and really understand how their tools can work better in concert together.
Yes, it was the case before. It mattered who got credit, and there was probably a lot of infighting to make certain that, someone got the credit. Rather now it's just saying, hey, we as a team, we kept the user. That's what matters.
Exactly.
So let's continue, because I love data. I love data points. So I went and I picked out a couple that were just, to me, spoke volumes, literally, right? So one, I'll give you, marketers are now prioritizing retention over acquisition. Yay! What is your take on this trend?
I mean, anytime you spend a ton of money on something and don't see returns, you're going to be wondering about your tactics. So with UA, it's more challenging than ever, and leaders are starting to care more about app retention and loyalty because it impacts their businesses meaningfully. Understanding the measurement of that is a key topic, and that's why we've invested so heavily at Adikteev in a in-house BI team that is not selling the customer anything. It's really explaining data and understanding user behavior, and that becomes a foundation for having a business conversation.
Over half of respondents are integrating AI and machine learning. Not surprising, but it is a game changer when you put it into a retention strategy, not just a creative strategy. How do you see AI transforming retention in the next, say, year or so?
Yeah, I mean, I think the possibilities are endless, but predicting churn and monetization to a much more accurate degree than we ever have, uh, and then reducing in-app friction points would be the other. From a product perspective, you can maximize the user's potential and predict that while limiting the hurdles you put in front of them on the product side. You're going to be in amazing shape compared to where we were a year ago.
And predictive, that's a big one. I hear so much about that. Another data point for you: 40% of marketers, no surprise, say they struggle. They struggle with measuring long term retention. Probably because we don't know what it is and how to measure it. We're still working on that. But what's the most common mistake you think they're making while they try to figure this out? How can they possibly fix it?
Yeah, I think the survey pointed to a huge number of actual metrics that you could point to. But at the end of the day, it's not rocket science, whichever one that you end up adopting. I think the key thing is patience. And oftentimes there's not a consistency in teams with a relatively high degree of turnover you see to say, we can't wait 3 years to see the fruits of our labor. But when you do, there's some pretty eye-opening numbers. So a case study we talked about on one of your older webinars and podcasts was this case study with Duolingo, where they try to incrementally increase their active user base by focusing on that engaged user base and doing some predictive segmentation rather than waiting to engage lapsed users. And they saw an incremental increase at the time, but it led to a 75% increase in weekly active users at the 3 year mark after running that. So, those things can be really eye-opening, but only with time and patience.
And it's the way you have to think now, because if you're not able to answer for what you think the return, the real return on investment is going to be, then a lot of stakeholders, shareholders are not patient with that. And one of the things that you also mentioned, and we're seeing it full circle here because it comes out in the survey as well as what we said at the top of the show, is that cross team approach is essential. It's a must. You have to have it for effective retention. Talked a little bit about how they need to work better, and they are starting to work better. But maybe there is something that we're not thinking of, some sort of easy way to foster better collaboration, even if it's just, something as simple as going out for dinner on occasion and getting to know each other. Who knows? Something super simple, because it's always the case that the big problems, they have a simple solution if you think them through.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of funny that you mentioned like going to dinner because I was in a meeting with a really big gaming client and lifecycle and performance were in the same room and got into a fight over who actually was going to maintain this part of the user journey because performance was limited to installs and lapsed users and that was it. And they were very territorial about how that worked out. So I think anytime you have humans involved, there's a natural tendency to overlook, you know, actually just getting to know one another, and then from there building a relationship enough to understand the tools at the disposal and what those do. And then from a business leader perspective, they're understanding it's table stakes for these teams to work better together. And so incentivizing that, and anytime you incentivize behaviors, it's going to have better outcomes. And so from both sides, that general adaptation to fostering an understanding of the other side, and then having a framework by the organization to condone, that symphony of tools working together is going to be really advantageous for those companies that adopt it. For instance, we're typically seen as a performance company because we do performance retargeting, but we've built that algorithm that predicts user churn and have integrated with partners like Braze, where you can actually upload segments directly into Braze, which is more of a typical lifecycle tool that marketers would use. And that's part of fostering that holistic vision of retention that we're trying to do even beyond our traditional retargeting product. And we offer that free for all retargeting clients because we want them to see the fruits of it without having to feel like they're being upsold on it.
It's proof of concept. It's saying, look, if you put the data into this dashboard in Braze, you're going to see segments differently. You're going to interact with them differently. And then you're going to understand and do what you're saying, which is about retargeting the audiences that matter, or at least the audiences according to their behavior. Let's talk about privacy and retargeting, because those two come together. And you and I, we have been in the industry for a while, and it looked like it was going to get pretty dire. But I also just did a fireside with Google and AppsFire, and we talked at length about the Privacy Sandbox initiative and got very geeky. So looking at the building blocks, the API, it was really exciting because guess what? They are there. There's things like the Protected Audience API, which allows publishers to remarket and retarget effectively. At least we're one step closer. What is your take? What is your thinking about Adikteev adapting to these realities and what marketers should be focusing on? Because again, privacy changes, they don't stop coming. But there is action marketers can take and things that you're enabling.
Yeah, I mean, it would be hard to beat Apple's approach in terms of how difficult it was for the industry. And we talked to Google quite a bit. So everything I've witnessed and heard is positive, generally collaborative, and wants to enable a future where we can still do our jobs while respecting users' right to privacy. And they're taking on that framework and trying to create something usable for the industry is just like a great first signal that there will be a future where we can really create new ways to engage with the user, measure them, and still respect, ultimately what everybody cares about at the end of the day.
So we share that opinion. Definitely. This privacy approach, more balanced than Apple's. Absolutely. Balance is one thing, but how does this balance create new opportunities? It's one thing to be able to do your job, which is a huge plus because it didn't happen with IDFA. But there are also opportunities there. What do you see? Maybe you can choose a blue ocean for us.
Yeah, philosophically at Adikteev, we had always taken the stance that deterministic measurement, deterministic campaigns were really important. And we weren't going to go outside of that because companies ultimately wouldn't be okay with something that wasn't verifiable. But with the privacy shifts, you saw a lot of companies jump into probabilistic targeting for good reason. But you're also opening yourself up to being taken advantage of with fraud and businesses that don't toe the line. So we've always advocated for deterministic, but companies did take advantage of that. And I think we're starting to really understand what tactics were being employed on that side and starting to educate the market a little bit more to the risks at the very least of doing that. There can be benefits too, obviously. But there was also kind of a misnomer among companies that because the audience was limited on iOS, you have I think a 30% to 20% opt-in rate generally. It was just impossible to do retargeting and it was dead. So let's just not do it at all. Again, coming back to the fruits of our BI team in-house, we prove out that there are ways to run profitable campaigns on iOS regardless of scale. And traditionally, we were more limited by the split between UA and retargeting on the budget side than we were on the addressable population. So really getting down in the numbers, which you like, on the client side, and proving out that there is still a very engaged and measurable population on iOS, and you can run profitable campaigns there regardless of scale is a huge kind of education point we have with almost every client that has an iOS app, but is now spending way more heavily on Android just because they don't feel like iOS is worth the effort, so to speak. And that's been a turning point to get some of them to go live again on iOS and really be able to understand that regardless of scale, it's still very profitable for us.
You said yourself, it's not necessarily about the scale. It's about the value, quality versus quantity, I guess.
Yeah, one of the other things that jumped out in the retention survey too is roughly half of companies were showing a separate privacy prompt to put in their own words why they were asking for consent and what that meant to them, which I think creates a much more one-to-one relationship with the user and the publisher. If you go beyond that simple Apple prompt and say like, hey, this is why we're asking for this. Only half of companies are doing that. And I think as you see increased adoption of a more personalized prompt, then users will opt in more. And then eventually you see, Apple implementing some basic framework in the latest version of Scan where you do get a re-engagement post back. Maybe that becomes a usable framework for companies like ours in the future for users that are opting out. But maybe that separate prompt is so widely used that opt-in rates become, much bigger than they have been in the recent years after the initial privacy shift.
Yeah, I remember interviewing actually an analyst from McKinsey, and he said that the prompt is an awesome opportunity to engage in sort of your brand voice. So every touch point matters. Why not make that into also an enjoyable conversation and say something different or explain the value proposition? So that makes a lot of sense what you're saying. And then, of course, the opt in rates are higher. And then the opportunities for marketers when we talk about how to grow through retention, how to retarget, equally higher. Well, I want to leave on a high note as well, because this series is about the leaders, about the biggest minds, but also the success stories and how that all comes together with you driving it as an individual. So, from your colleagues, they describe you as someone, and I quote, you have a mind blowing attitude when it comes to problem solving, Cam. So, your ability to blow minds, not just in the data that we had the deep dive into, not just the numbers, but absolutely your human qualities. Powerful, patient, in a sense, perhaps. How do you balance this in such a high pressure, high competitive environment?
Yeah, I'm not sure who you spoke with because as an adopted French person at a French company, insults are way more common than compliments. So that's just a reality, but I'll take it. At the end of the day, everybody expects positive outcomes in business. And when it's not working, people obviously get stressed. So I think you need to find a true north. And for me, it's listening to people and helping them when I can, and then recognizing when I can't and being honest. I think your love of data and our love of data, we have a shared love for really understanding user behavior, has always been the foundation for what we do at Adikteev. And we don't have to take a salesperson's word for it. We can dig into the numbers and explain why this makes sense for their business. And at the end of the day, that's much more reasonable to me than any sales pitch or, trying to convince somebody otherwise.
And that gets to my second question, because growth is partially a professional endeavor and it's how you approach it, but it's also deeply personal. That's why we talk about professional growth, personal growth. What keeps you personally inspired in this industry that's always moving, yet you have to maintain your drive amidst this constant change? So, what do you draw from, Cam?
Yeah, again, I need to take off my adopted French hat and compliment you and say it's getting to be around people like you and participate in a global industry that has friendly faces, whether you're in France, in Korea, or even in Brazil. Seeing the participation and eagerness of marketers to grow in the markets we serve is a really great mood enhancer. But to be around those folks like yourself that have a natural curiosity and inclination to want to grow is one of the most rewarding things that I take away.
That's beautiful. And thank you so much, Cam. But also to your point, when you think about it, and so even when you're just with people and can pick up on that energy and what they say, you're going to keep it essential. You're going to keep it real. And keeping it real, before we wrap up, yes, want to go back to what we were discussing. We started talking about retention. Um, Shifts, innovations. I mean, you're there. You have to see around corners. What do you see on the horizon that could significantly impact the way we approach app growth and retention?
Yeah, it's an obvious one, but AI is moving so quickly that those that aren't constantly exploring even the small ways that it can help their businesses are going to lose out big in the future. I think it's can be intimidating, especially to folks longer in the tooth that have been around a while and haven't grown up with these things as natural. But really pushing yourself to be curious and adopting these things as a marketer is going to pay off huge dividends, like we talk about with the Duolingo case study, and not even waiting 3 years. Within a year, I think predictive models are kind of the start. So understanding the likely outcome of the monetization of a user, or preventing the churn of that user, and really employing the tools you already have at your disposal that are here today to execute on those, that becomes a jumping off point for so many other things that are possible based on this new type of technology.
We're all learning this new way together. First of all, Cam, really just a delight having you on the special mini series High Five in the App Growth Show. If I could, I would give you a high five for this show. It's just been great to hear from you. And I'm sure that our listeners will want to do the same. So if they hear something they like, they want to understand more, they want to stay connected with you, hear more about Adikteev, what's the best way to reach out, or maybe even connect? Hey, I said lots of things happen at dinners. Maybe you're going to be somewhere and they can meet up with you.
Yeah, absolutely. My big head is on LinkedIn, so you can find me there. Email Cameron at Adikteev.com, and then my role is shifting less from international to more US, but of course our team is going to be at all the conferences, fostering separate small roundtables around retention and loyalty to have these types of conversations around the major conferences. So look for that in the future.
I'm a great fan of smaller roundtables. You actually do get to deep dive. Love deep diving with you as well. And to our audience, if you found this valuable, then don't forget to subscribe, share it with your friends, share it with your network, share it with your tribe, and stay tuned for more in the App Growth Show, this special series where we touch down with the biggest minds that have driven the biggest results in mobile. Until next time, thanks for listening.